The year is 1801. John Adams, the second President of the United States, is in the final hours of his presidency. The country is on edge. Thomas Jefferson, his bitter political rival, has just won one of the most contentious elections in American history. In these final moments, Adams makes a move that would forever shape the early republic. He appoints a slew of judges, often referred to as the Midnight Judges. These appointments are controversial, political, and, some would argue, a deliberate attempt to tie the hands of Jefferson's incoming administration. Imagine being Jefferson, about to take the reins of the presidency, only to find a judiciary pact with your opponents. How would you respond? Would this be considered legitimate governance, or was it a direct attempt to sabotage your presidency before it even began? This is the story of ambition, strategy, and the early tests of political power in the United States. It is also a story that leads directly to one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in American history, Marbury versus Madison. In this video, we will explore a question that historians still debate. Did John Adams' midnight judicial appointments sabotage Thomas Jefferson's presidency? To understand the full story, we first need to go back to the political landscape of the United States in the late 1790s. The country was young, barely more than 2 decades old, and deeply divided along political lines. John Adams, a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, represented not just different personalities, but fundamentally different visions for the nation. Federalists favored a strong central government and close ties with Britain, while Jefferson and his allies pushed for states' rights and a more agrarian-focused economy. The election of 1800 was intensely contested. Jefferson and Aaron Burr ended up tied in the Electoral College, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. Amid this turmoil, Adams and the Federalists became increasingly anxious about losing their influence. One way to maintain their power was through the judiciary. Unlike the presidency or Congress, judicial appointments were for life, meaning that a Federalist judge could wield influence long after Jefferson took office. This brings us to the Judiciary Act of 1801. Passed in the final months of the Adams administration, this act created new courts and judgeships, which Adams quickly filled with loyal Federalists. These appointments, made in the last hours of his presidency, became known as the Midnight Judges. Jefferson viewed these actions as a direct threat. When his administration began, he refused to deliver the commissions for several of these judges, setting up a confrontation that culminated in the landmark Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. By the late 1790s, the young United States was already divided into 2 opposing political camps. John Adams, the second president, led the Federalists, who favored a strong central government, commercial growth, and close ties with Britain. They believed that a centralized authority was essential to maintaining order and stability in a nation still feeling the aftershocks of revolution. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, represented the Democratic Republicans, a party that championed states' rights, limited federal power, and an economy rooted in agriculture. Jeffersonian feared that too much central authority could lead to tyranny, recalling the British monarchy they had fought to escape. This ideological divide extended beyond policy. It influenced public opinion, the press, and even social circles, creating a climate of intense partisanship. These divisions intensified after the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, which allowed the federal government to target immigrants and punish critics of the administration. Jefferson and his allies denounced these laws as unconstitutional, arguing that they infringed on individual freedoms and the rights of states. Federalists, by contrast, claimed the laws were necessary for national security in a time of potential war with France. The stage was set for one of the most heated elections in American history. The presidential election of 1800, sometimes called the Revolution of 1800, was a turning point for the young republic. Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, ran against John Adams and Charles C. Pinckney. The campaign was fierce, marked by personal attacks, accusations of corruption, and deep ideological battles. When the votes were counted, Jefferson and Burr ended up tied with 73 Electoral College votes each. This tie threw the decision to the House of Representatives, as required by the Constitution. The Federalists, still in control of the House, were faced with the difficult choice of choosing between two candidates who were technically from the same party, Jefferson being the Democratic-Republican nominee. After 36 ballots, Jefferson was finally elected president, with Burr as vice president. For Adams, this was a bitter defeat. After 4 years of attempting to strengthen the Federalist agenda, he was now leaving office in the hands of a political opponent. Federalists feared that Jefferson's administration would dismantle the policies they had fought to establish, especially the judicial reforms and laws enacted during Adams' term. This fear would drive some of Adams' last-minute decisions. Federalists understood that while they were losing the presidency, they could still influence the future through the judiciary. Judges held lifetime appointments, meaning their political influence could persist long after the president who appointed them had left office. This made judicial appointments one of the few tools remaining to maintain Federalist power. The Federalists also viewed the judiciary as a stabilizing force. They believed the courts could safeguard the Constitution against what they considered radical Democratic-Republican policies. In the final months of his presidency, Adams and his allies moved quickly to pass the Judiciary Act of 1801. This act reorganized the federal court system, creating new courts and positions that Adams could fill with Federalist loyalists. These last-minute appointments became known as the Midnight Judges. They were controversial not only because they were rushed but also because they were seen as an attempt to embed Federalist influence into the government indefinitely. For Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, this was more than a political annoyance. It was a direct challenge to their authority and their vision for the country. The stage was now set for a confrontation between an outgoing president attempting to secure his party's legacy and an incoming president determined to assert his own authority. The tension between Adams' Federalist strategy and Jefferson's Republican ideals would soon spill into one of the most significant legal battles in American history. In February 1801, Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, just months before Thomas Jefferson would take office. This law restructured the federal court system in a way that gave the outgoing Federalist administration an unprecedented opportunity to influence the judiciary for years to come. The act reduced the number of Supreme Court justices from 6 to 5 upon the next vacancy and created 16 new federal judgeships along with numerous clerks and administrative positions. These positions were to be filled immediately, and importantly, judges were appointed for life. In the eyes of Federalists, this was a way to ensure that their political ideals, support for a strong central government and Federalist interpretations of the Constitution, would continue to shape American law even after they lost the presidency. Federalists argued that this reorganization was necessary for efficiency. The judiciary was expanding as the nation grew, and new positions were needed to handle the increasing workload. But to Jefferson and his allies, it appeared as a blatant political maneuver. By creating new seats and filling them with loyalists, the outgoing administration could continue to wield influence in what was supposed to be a co-equal branch of government. The Judiciary Act of 1801 became a symbol of last-minute political maneuvering. While it was legally passed by Congress and signed by the president, its timing and purpose raised immediate suspicions. Many saw it as a Federalist attempt to pack the courts and undermine the incoming Democratic-Republican administration before it even began. In the final weeks of his presidency, John Adams moved quickly to appoint Federalist loyalists to the newly created judgeships. These appointments included a mix of experienced lawyers, loyal party members, and political allies. Among the most important figures appointed was John Marshall, already a highly respected statesman, who would go on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a position he held for over 3 decades. Adams' appointments were controversial for several reasons. First, the sheer speed and timing of the nominations gave the impression of a frantic effort to solidify Federalist influence. Many were literally signed and delivered on the last night of his presidency, hence the term Midnight Judges. Second, the appointments often bypassed local or state-level political considerations, highlighting their purely partisan nature. While some appointees were eminently qualified, others were seen as political rewards. Federalists defended these choices, arguing that the president had the constitutional authority to appoint judges at any time and that Adams was simply fulfilling his duty. Republican critics, however, portrayed the appointments as an attempt to sabotage the new administration, a deliberate effort to block Jefferson from implementing his policies. The most famous case resulting from these appointments involved William Marbury, a justice of the peace in the District of Columbia. Marbury's commission had been signed by Adams but not delivered before Jefferson took office. Jefferson ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, to withhold the commission, setting the stage for the landmark Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison. These appointments did more than just fill positions. They symbolized a clash of political ideologies and highlighted the tension between outgoing and incoming administrations. Adams' actions ensured that the Federalists would retain significant influence over the judiciary, creating a lasting impact on the balance of power in the federal government. The immediate reaction to Adams' midnight appointments was intense and divided along party lines. Federalists praised Adams for protecting the Constitution and ensuring that the judiciary would remain independent and competent. They argued that the judiciary was meant to act as a check on the executive and legislative branches, and by filling it with loyal Federalists, Adams was securing the rule of law against what they perceived as potentially dangerous Democratic-Republican policies. Republicans, on the other hand, saw the appointments as a direct affront. Jefferson and his allies viewed the midnight judges as an attempt to entrench Federalist power and obstruct their policy goals. The refusal to deliver some commissions, including that of William Marbury, was the first step in what Jefferson hoped would neutralize the Federalist influence on the courts. Newspapers, pamphlets, and political commentators on both sides turned the issue into a public spectacle, framing it as either a heroic defense of the Constitution or a cynical power grab. The term midnight judges itself reflected the perception of illegitimacy. It evoked images of secretive, hurried appointments made under the cover of darkness to undermine the democratic process. Even among Federalists, some questioned whether the optics of such last-minute maneuvering were wise, fearing that it could provoke public backlash. Ultimately, the midnight judges set the stage for one of the first major constitutional confrontations in American history. They forced Jefferson to confront not only legal questions about the delivery of commissions but also political and philosophical questions about the nature of presidential power, judicial independence, and the limits of partisanship. When Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in March 1801, he was immediately confronted with the reality of John Adams' last-minute judicial appointments. Many of the commissions for the newly created judges had already been signed but, crucially, not delivered. This included William Marbury, who had been appointed as a justice of the peace in the District of Columbia. Jefferson viewed the entire effort as a deliberate attempt to tie the hands of his administration before it had even begun. Jefferson's reaction was swift and decisive. He ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver certain commissions. This move was both a practical and symbolic gesture. Practically, it prevented Federalist judges from assuming office and potentially blocking Jefferson's policies. Symbolically, it signaled to his supporters that he would not tolerate what he saw as an underhanded Federalist strategy. Jefferson and his allies framed these appointments as an abuse of power. They argued that Adams, by signing commissions in the last hours of his presidency, had overstepped the spirit of the Constitution. While technically legal, Jefferson claimed that these midnight judges were not legitimate because the new administration had not had the chance to exercise its authority. This early confrontation would test both the limits of presidential power and the independence of the judiciary. One of the most famous outcomes of Jefferson's confrontation with the midnight judges was the case of Marbury versus Madison, decided by the Supreme Court in 1803. William Marbury, whose commission had been signed by Adams but withheld by Jefferson, petitioned the Supreme Court for a writ of mandamus, a court order forcing Madison to deliver the commission. At the heart of the case was a complex legal question. Did Marbury have a right to his commission, and if so, could the Supreme Court compel the Secretary of State to deliver it? This question quickly became more than a procedural dispute. It was a test of the balance of power between the executive branch and the judiciary. Chief Justice John Marshall, Adams' appointee and a Federalist, wrote the opinion that would change American law forever. Marshall ruled that Marbury did have a right to his commission but also concluded that the Supreme Court did not have the authority to issue a writ of mandamus in this situation. the law that would have allowed the court to compel Madison, the Judiciary Act of 1789, was declared unconstitutional. The significance of this ruling was enormous. While Marbury did not get his commission, the decision established the principle of judicial review, giving the Supreme Court the power to strike down laws that conflict with the Constitution. Jefferson, who had hoped to neutralize Federalist influence on the courts, had inadvertently presided over a decision that strengthened the judiciary. Jefferson's response to the midnight judges extended beyond the courtroom. Politically, he sought to limit Federalist influence through Congress, which was now controlled by Democratic Republicans. One of the first major moves was the repeal of the Judiciary Act of 1801, which abolished the newly created judgeships and reduced the number of positions that Federalists could occupy. This legislative action was a clear message. Jefferson would not allow the last-minute appointments to dictate his administration's agenda. It also demonstrated his understanding of the political landscape. While the Constitution gave Adams the authority to appoint judges, Jefferson could use Congress to alter the structure of the courts and reduce the long-term impact of the Federalist strategy. Jefferson's approach combined legal caution with political calculation. He avoided direct confrontation with the Supreme Court over the Marbury case while simultaneously leveraging Republican control of Congress to reshape the judiciary. This dual strategy allowed him to assert his administration's authority without provoking a constitutional crisis. The episode also served as a lesson in the limits of presidential power. Jefferson realized that while he could resist or delay the effects of Adams' appointments, he could not completely undo them. The courts, especially under Chief Justice Marshall, would remain a powerful independent force, shaping the interpretation of law for decades to come. The case of Marbury versus Madison, decided in 1803, was one of the earliest and most significant tests of the United States Constitution. William Marbury had been appointed a Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia by outgoing President John Adams, but his commission was never delivered. Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to hand over the commission, prompting Marbury to petition the Supreme Court for a writ of mandamus, a court order compelling Madison to act. Chief Justice John Marshall, himself a Federalist and an Adams appointee, faced a delicate situation. He had to navigate a politically charged dispute without directly provoking a conflict with the executive branch. In his landmark ruling, Marshall made a brilliant legal maneuver. He acknowledged that Marbury had a right to his commission but ruled that the Supreme Court did not have the power to issue a writ of mandamus under the Judiciary Act of 1789, because that portion of the law was unconstitutional. This decision established a crucial precedent: judicial review. The Supreme Court now had the authority to strike down laws that conflicted with the Constitution. By asserting this power, Marshall strengthened the judiciary and established its role as an independent check on the other branches of government. While Marbury himself did not receive his commission, the case dramatically reshaped the balance of power in the early republic. It confirmed that the courts were not subordinate to the president or Congress, and it ensured that Federalist influence would persist through judicial authority, even in the face of Democratic-Republican control of the executive and legislative branches. For Jefferson, the ruling was both a victory and a warning. On one hand, he successfully prevented Marbury from taking office, which aligned with his goal of limiting Federalist influence in the judiciary. On the other hand, the establishment of judicial review signaled that the courts would remain a powerful independent force that could check his administration's policies. Jefferson understood that while he could use Congress to repeal laws or reduce the number of Federalist judges, the Supreme Court itself would remain beyond his direct control. This realization shaped how he approached governance for the rest of his presidency. Jefferson learned that political victories could be undermined by legal authority, and that the judiciary could act as a long-term obstacle to the will of the elected executive. This tension between executive ambition and judicial independence would continue to influence American politics for decades. Jefferson's reaction to the Marbury decision demonstrated his pragmatism. He chose to respect the ruling even though it limited his immediate goals, recognizing that a direct confrontation with the Supreme Court could provoke a constitutional crisis that might destabilize the young nation. The Midnight Judges episode and the Marbury decision had profound and lasting consequences for the U.S. judiciary. Chief Justice John Marshall, a Federalist appointee, used his position to shape the Supreme Court into a co-equal branch of government. Under his leadership, the court consistently asserted its authority to interpret the Constitution and review the actions of the executive and legislative branches. This era established several key principles: the supremacy of the Constitution, the legitimacy of judicial review, and the enduring influence of lifetime judicial appointments. Even though Jefferson sought to limit Federalist influence, the courts maintained significant power and independence. This episode underscored the importance of the judiciary as a stabilizing institution in American government, capable of standing above partisan politics. The broader impact was clear. Adams' midnight appointments may have been controversial, but they succeeded in embedding Federalist influence within the judicial branch. Even as the Democratic-Republicans gained power in Congress and the presidency, the courts remained a domain where Federalist principles could continue to guide legal interpretations. In essence, Adams' last-minute strategy achieved its primary goal, ensuring that Federalist ideas endured beyond his presidency. From the Federalist point of view, John Adams' actions were entirely legitimate. Federalists argued that Adams had the constitutional authority to make judicial appointments up until the end of his term. Article 2 of the Constitution grants the President the power to appoint judges with the advice and consent of the Senate. In their view, Adams was exercising a legal prerogative, fulfilling his duty to the nation rather than acting out of partisanship. Federalists also maintained that the judiciary should act as a stabilizing force in government. The Democratic Republicans, in their eyes, were radicals threatening the balance of power. By appointing loyal Federalist judges, Adams ensured that the courts would continue to interpret the Constitution in ways that promoted stability and protected federal authority. It was not sabotage but prudent governance, a safeguard against what Federalists saw as Jefferson's potentially destabilizing policies. Moreover, Federalists could argue that the Judiciary Act of 1801 addressed genuine administrative needs. The courts were expanding as the nation grew, and additional judgeships were necessary to handle the increasing workload. The appointments were not purely political. They served a practical function in addition to reinforcing Federalist influence. Finally, the Federalist perspective emphasizes the long-term benefits of Adams' actions. By appointing competent, experienced judges, he helped establish a professional judiciary capable of handling complex legal questions. Chief Justice John Marshall, the most significant of these appointments, would go on to strengthen the Supreme Court and shape American law for decades, a legacy that both Federalists and historians view as foundational to the nation's legal system. From the Jeffersonian perspective, the midnight judges were a deliberate attempt to sabotage the incoming administration. Jefferson and his allies saw Adams' last-minute appointments as an underhanded effort to undermine the democratic process and entrench Federalist power in the government. Jefferson's primary concern was that lifetime judicial appointments could block his legislative and executive initiatives. The judiciary, under Federalist influence, could interpret laws in ways that hindered Republican policy goals, effectively limiting the power of the people's elected representatives. From this viewpoint, the midnight judges represented not just a political strategy but an existential threat to the Democratic-Republican vision for the nation. Jefferson's response, including withholding commissions and working with Congress to repeal the Judiciary Act of 1801, reflected his view that the appointments were illegitimate. The controversy surrounding Marbury versus Madison further reinforced the perception that Federalists were using the courts as a tool of political obstruction. Jefferson saw the judiciary as being manipulated for partisan gain, an action that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Constitution. Additionally, Jeffersonians criticized the secrecy and timing of the appointments. Signing commissions in the last hours of a presidency created the impression of deception and manipulation, reinforcing the narrative that Adams was acting to sabotage the incoming administration rather than to serve the public interest. Modern historians offer a nuanced interpretation of the midnight judges. Some argue that Adams' actions were indeed strategic but not necessarily malicious. From this perspective, Adams acted within his constitutional authority, aware that his party was about to lose control of the executive branch. He sought to secure the Federalist legacy, particularly in the judiciary, which would remain independent and influential for decades. Other scholars emphasize the partisan context of the era. Early American politics were intensely polarized, and actions that today might seem extreme were, at the time, part of standard political maneuvering. Adams' midnight appointments were controversial, yes, but they reflected the reality of a political system in which outgoing administrations often sought to preserve influence. Some historians frame the controversy as a question of perception versus intent. Federalists may have genuinely believed they were acting in the nation's best interest, while Jeffersonians perceived sabotage because the appointments directly opposed their policy goals. In this sense, whether Adams sabotaged Jefferson depends largely on interpretation. Legally, Adams acted within his authority. Politically, the move was undeniably confrontational. Finally, the legacy of the Midnight Judges is widely acknowledged as significant. The appointments, particularly of John Marshall, had lasting consequences for the U.S. judiciary. Marshall's decisions strengthened the Supreme Court and established judicial review, a cornerstone of American governance. Whether this outcome was part of a deliberate attempt to sabotage Jefferson or simply the result of prudent political strategy, the enduring impact on the nation's legal framework is undeniable. Thomas Jefferson entered the presidency with high expectations from his supporters, but the shadow of John Adams' Midnight Judges quickly complicated his early administration. Federalist judges appointed in the final hours of Adams' presidency retained significant authority in courts across the country, particularly at the local and federal levels. These judges had the potential to obstruct Jefferson's policy initiatives, slow the implementation of Democratic-Republican legislation, and influence public perception in ways unfavorable to his administration. Jefferson and his allies faced a delicate balancing act. On one hand, they needed to assert control over the executive branch and demonstrate that Republican policies would be carried out. On the other, they had to respect the independence of the judiciary, particularly after the Marbury versus Madison ruling established judicial review. Any overt attempt to remove or undermine Federalist judges risked a constitutional confrontation and could have damaged the legitimacy of his presidency. The presence of Federalist judges also influenced Jefferson's approach to governance. He became more cautious in his interactions with the courts and more strategic in the timing and selection of his own appointments. This early challenge shaped his leadership style, emphasizing prudence and patience in dealing with institutions beyond the direct reach of the presidency. The impact of the Midnight Judges extended into Jefferson's policy agenda. While he had campaigned on reducing government spending, limiting federal authority, and rolling back Federalist policies, the lingering influence of Federalist judges meant that some of these initiatives faced obstacles in implementation. For example, Federalist judges were more likely to interpret laws in ways that favored central authority, complicating Jefferson's efforts to decentralize power and promote states' rights. Jefferson responded by using Congress to address the structural aspects of the judiciary. The repeal of the Judiciary Act of 1801, for instance, eliminated some of the positions created by Adams, reducing Federalist influence in the lower courts. However, lifetime appointments could not be reversed, meaning that the Federalist presence in the courts remained a permanent feature of American governance. Despite these challenges, Jefferson was able to advance much of his agenda. By carefully navigating legal constraints and employing political strategy, he maintained control over executive functions and pursued major initiatives like reducing the national debt, scaling back military spending, and promoting agricultural interests. The early confrontation with the judiciary, however, reminded Jefferson that policy success would often depend on negotiation, compromise, and respect for institutional boundaries. The Midnight Judges episode provided Jefferson with important lessons about the interplay between politics, law, and institutional power. He learned that presidential authority had limits, particularly when it came to lifetime judicial appointments. The judiciary, once empowered, could operate independently and resist the policies of an incoming administration, regardless of the political party in power. This experience also influenced Jefferson's approach to future appointments. He became more deliberate in selecting judges and officials, balancing political loyalty with competence and public perception. The episode underscored the importance of long-term strategy in governance. Actions taken by outgoing administrations could have ripple effects for decades. Finally, Jefferson came to appreciate the value of political restraint. By avoiding direct confrontation with the Supreme Court, he maintained the legitimacy of his presidency and avoided a constitutional crisis. The episode demonstrated that leadership often required patience, strategy, and careful consideration of institutional power, lessons that would guide Jefferson throughout his 2 terms in office. One of the most lasting impacts of the Midnight Judges was on the American judiciary. The appointments made by John Adams, particularly that of John Marshall as Chief Justice, fundamentally shaped the Supreme Court and its role in government. Marshall's tenure, which lasted over 3 decades, transformed the court into a co-equal branch of government capable of asserting its authority through judicial review. The Marbury versus Madison case, arising directly from the midnight appointments, established judicial review as a cornerstone of the U.S. legal system. This principle allowed the Supreme Court to strike down laws that conflicted with the Constitution, ensuring that the judiciary could serve as a check on both the executive and legislative branches. By creating a lifetime of Federalist influence in the courts, Adams inadvertently helped establish the Supreme Court as a stabilizing force in American politics. Even beyond the Supreme Court, the appointments influenced lower courts, which retained Federalist judges for years. These judges often interpreted laws in ways that reflected Federalist ideals of strong national government, creating a lasting counterbalance to Democratic-Republican policies. The judiciary, therefore, became a permanent arena for ideological influence, a legacy that continues in various forms to this day. Politically, the Midnight Judges episode set a precedent for the tension between outgoing and incoming administrations. It demonstrated that presidents could use the final months of their term to secure lasting influence, a tactic repeated in later periods of American history. At the same time, it highlighted the potential for conflict between branches of government, particularly when appointments were seen as partisan maneuvers rather than administrative necessities. Historically, the controversy surrounding the Midnight Judges offers insight into the intense partisanship of the early republic. Federalists and Democratic Republicans both viewed the judiciary as a key instrument of power, and their battles over appointments reflected broader ideological struggles over the direction of the nation. The episode illustrates how the interplay of law, politics, and personal ambition shaped the foundations of American governance. Historians continue to debate Adams' intentions. Some see the appointments as a cynical attempt to undermine Jefferson. Others view them as a legitimate, even prudent, use of presidential authority. What is clear is that the episode had profound consequences for the balance of power in the United States, influencing both the judiciary and the broader political landscape. The Midnight Judges left a mark on American political culture as well. The term itself, evoking secretive, last-minute maneuvering, became a symbol of political intrigue and partisan strategy. It shaped public perceptions of both Adams and Jefferson, framing Adams as a crafty strategist and Jefferson as a defender of democratic principles. The episode also helped establish the idea that the judiciary could be a source of political influence, not merely an impartial arbiter of the law. This perception persists in American political discourse, where debates over judicial appointments remain highly charged. The Midnight Judges, therefore, contributed to a long-standing understanding that control over the courts can have lasting consequences for national policy and ideology. In popular memory, the story underscores the drama and stakes of the early republic. It highlights how personal ambition, party loyalty, and constitutional authority intersected in ways that still resonate today, offering a cautionary tale about the power of last-minute political maneuvers. The story of John Adams' Midnight Judges is a tale of political rivalry, constitutional power, and lasting influence. In the final days of his presidency, Adams moved quickly to appoint a series of Federalist judges, reshaping the judiciary just as Thomas Jefferson prepared to assume office. These appointments, enabled by the Judiciary Act of 1801, included some of the most prominent figures in American law, notably John Marshall, who would go on to define the Supreme Court for generations. Jefferson reacted by refusing to deliver some commissions, prompting the famous Marbury versus Madison case. While Marbury did not ultimately receive his commission, the ruling established judicial review, solidifying the Supreme Court as a co-equal branch of government. Adams' last-minute actions, Jefferson's legal and political responses, and the ensuing court decisions set the stage for an early confrontation between executive authority, judicial power, and partisan politics. These events reveal the high stakes of early American governance. They show how political maneuvering, legal interpretation, and institutional authority can collide in ways that shape the nation for decades. Understanding this context is essential for assessing whether Adams' actions constituted sabotage or simply strategic governance. So, did John Adams sabotage Jefferson's presidency? The answer depends on perspective. From Jefferson's point of view, the midnight judges were clearly an obstruction, a partisan effort to undermine his authority before he could even take office. The appointments threatened Democratic-Republican policy goals and created immediate political challenges, giving the appearance of deliberate sabotage. From the Federalist perspective, however, Adams acted within his constitutional rights. He fulfilled his duty as president, strengthened the judiciary, and ensured that Federalist principles would endure. The appointments were legal, timely, and strategically aligned with the long-term interests of the nation. In this sense, what Jefferson perceived as sabotage may have been intended as prudent governance. Modern historians tend to offer a nuanced view. While the midnight judges were undeniably political, they also established a judiciary that could function independently of the executive. Adams' actions had both partisan and national implications, simultaneously challenging Jefferson while laying the foundation for a stronger, more balanced government. The Midnight Judges episode illustrates the complex interplay of power, law, and politics in the early United States. It shows how even legally legitimate actions can be perceived as hostile, depending on timing, context, and political rivalry. Adams' appointments were a test of presidential authority, judicial independence, and the resilience of American institutions. While Jefferson faced immediate challenges, the confrontation also strengthened the judiciary and clarified the principle of judicial review. The events underscore a key lesson: in governance, strategy and perception matter as much as legality. Adams may have intended to protect his party's influence, but the result was a lasting impact on the structure and balance of American government, a legacy that continues to shape the nation today. Whether one view Adams' actions as sabotage or strategic foresight, the Midnight Judges remain a defining moment in U.S. history, demonstrating the enduring tension between politics, law, and leadership in the American Republic.